I mean, it's the biggest choke I have seen in any sport at the championship level.
I looked at the Spurs, Reg, and it sounds strange to say that the younger team was more tired.
Youth and inexperience. And I think we were all waiting for this youth and inexperience to show up.
There's a version of this story where San Antonio wins the championship outright. It's not some distant fantasy either, not even close. It's separated from reality by a shockingly thin margin, a margin so small it barely fills up a single quarter of professional basketball. Their franchise centerpiece delivered some of the most jaw-dropping individual performances this league has witnessed in years, night after night on the biggest stage possible. And still, somehow, it wasn't quite enough to close the gap completely. The reason why sits buried inside one specific number, a weakness so precise and predictable that an entire opposing team built their whole game plan around exploiting it for 5 consecutive games straight. Now, an entire offseason.
Maybe that had a little bit to do with fatigue, but I stated on air, I think it was in game 5 or 6 when the Knicks were just waiting on who was going to win that series. I said, it doesn't matter who wins here in the Western Conference. The Knicks were going to win. You could just see how cohesive the Knicks had been playing.
Across this entire playoff run, San Antonio genuinely looked like the better basketball team on paper. Their generational superstar was putting together historic scoring nights, numbers that flirted with 60 points combined with 20 rebounds against championship-level opposition. By pure statistical control, this team dominated roughly 70% of the finals matchup from start to finish. Yet somehow, 5 games later, they were the ones packing their bags for the summer. The explanation comes down to one brutal pattern that repeated itself over and over. The second their franchise big man sat for even a short breather, the entire interior defense fell apart completely. New York's primary ball handler attacked that exact gap relentlessly, forcing backup bigs into matchups they were never built to handle. That single vulnerability pushed the head coach into a genuinely difficult, uncomfortable spot, extending his star's workload toward 40 full minutes a night just to keep the team afloat and competitive against elite opposition. Nobody watching thought that was a sustainable plan going forward long-term, and by the time the offseason officially began, the mission felt painfully obvious to everyone paying close attention.
It's the dumbest stretch of basketball at a championship level I've ever seen. The dumbest.
Here's where this story stops being a simple front court problem and turns into something far more complicated and far more expensive to fix. Buried inside the box scores of these finals sits a statistic that barely got mentioned anywhere during the actual series broadcast itself. When San Antonio's rookie guard shared the floor alongside their franchise big man, this team absolutely obliterated New York by more than 15 points per 100 possessions, a genuinely staggering number to produce in a series decided by the smallest of margins. And yet that same rookie spent the entire finals stuck behind the incumbent starter, a guard currently attached to a contract worth well over $200 million guaranteed. That starter struggled mightily in crunch time throughout the series and finished with an average barely cracking 13 points a night against elite defensive pressure. Once that particular stat started circulating widely among analysts, the entire framing of this offseason shifted overnight, almost instantly. This was no longer purely a size and depth conversation limited to the front court. It became a much bigger conversation about money, about roles, about pride, and about which direction. San Antonio wasted zero time addressing the problem they could actually fix immediately, right from the opening picks of the entire draft. With their first selection of the night, they rolled the dice on an 18-year-old defensive specialist who had already broken a freshman shot-blocking record before a devastating knee injury cut his promising season short entirely. His block rate numbers were genuinely elite, rare even by NBA standards for a player his exact age and experience level, but the recovery timeline stretched out to roughly 6 full months, meaning he simply couldn't contribute anytime soon, no matter how talented he eventually proves himself to be down the line. Recognizing that immediate gap, the front office moved aggressively a second time before the night was over. They packaged a future draft asset and jumped back into the first round to grab a physically dominant, championship-tested big man straight out of a recent national title run. This second selection brought exactly what the roster needed most urgently right now: real bulk, real toughness, and genuine rebounding instincts that translate immediately without requiring years of patient developmental time. One swing aimed squarely at the future ceiling, one swing aimed directly at fixing next season's rotation right now, immediately. Together, these two additions. This is exactly where the offseason stops being straightforward and turns genuinely complicated for everyone involved. The raw finals numbers painted a rough picture for San Antonio's starting point guard, someone entering year 2 of a massive contract extension worth nearly $250 million guaranteed. But context absolutely matters here, and it matters a great deal once you zoom out and look at the entire season as a whole. He suffered a serious ankle injury earlier in the postseason during an earlier round, and arguably never fully recovered his usual burst and explosiveness for the remainder of that playoff run. Before that specific setback occurred, he was playing at a genuinely elite level consistently, night in and night out, and this franchise almost certainly doesn't reach the finals at all without everything he contributed across the entire regular season leading up to it. Multiple league sources have reportedly continued viewing him as a legitimate cornerstone piece for this team's long-term future plans, which makes any kind of immediate trade scenario extremely unlikely to unfold this summer or even next, particularly with his trade value clouded significantly by an injury-affected postseason performance on the biggest stage possible in the sport. Meanwhile, the front office also quietly tackled a completely separate weakness that haunted this roster throughout the entire playoff run: a genuine, glaring lack of perimeter shooting from the supporting cast surrounding the two stars. The starting core combined to shoot barely 33% from beyond the arc across the entire playoffs, which allowed opposing defenses to essentially ignore the perimeter entirely and pack the paint without facing any real punishment whatsoever for doing so. The front office answered that specific problem directly by signing an experienced veteran forward to a modest 2-year contract, a player who connected on nearly 37% of his threes just last season alone with a different team. Pair that shooting addition with a high... Here's the actual problem looming over this entire franchise going forward, and it's not something you can simply trade or draft your way around, no matter how aggressive the front office continues to get in the coming years. San Antonio currently possesses one of the deepest, most promising young cores anywhere across the entire league right now. But under the league's current financial structure and salary cap rules, keeping a talented group like this fully intact becomes brutally expensive within just a couple of short seasons from today. Right now, 2 of their most impactful young players remain locked into affordable rookie-scale salaries, which gives the front office genuine breathing room to surround their superstar with proven veteran talent without immediately blowing up the entire payroll structure. That financial window, though, is closing faster than most fans probably realize sitting at home. The current point guard extension already consumes a significant chunk of future cap space entirely on its own, and everyone around the league already understands that their franchise cornerstone's next contract is coming eventually, one that will completely overshadow every other single salary on this roster once it's finally signed and finalized. Once every single core piece is earning maximum money at the exact same time, the roster building flexibility available today essentially disappears entirely from the equation. Trade options shrink dramatically across the board, useful financial exceptions vanish overnight without warning. Every single contract on the books suddenly has to justify its own continued existence with almost zero margin for error remaining anywhere. That harsh reality is precisely why the point guard situation carries so much more long-term weight than one disappointing series alone ever could on its own merit. San Antonio eventually has to decide, and probably sooner rather than later given the timeline, whether their current veteran starter truly remains the ideal long-term partner for their franchise superstar going forward, or whether their young rookie's undeniable on-court chemistry eventually forces a much tougher conversation about where this entire organization is genuinely headed in the years ahead. And remembering that every single move made this offseason connects back to one shared, unified goal: closing the tiny gap that separated this team from an actual championship parade down Main Street. New size and toughness added in the front court, real, legitimate shooting added on the wings, a stronger, deeper coaching staff working behind the bench every single day. On paper, this roster genuinely looks more complete, more balanced, and far more dangerous than the group that walked into last year's finals with obvious holes still showing for opponents to exploit. But underneath all of that careful roster building, one massive question still hasn't been answered by anyone wearing a suit in that front office. Two talented guards, one franchise destined to build entirely around a generational superstar, and a decision that could ultimately shape the identity of this entire organization for the next full decade. If the young core keeps trending upward at anywhere near this current rate of development, that decision is coming whether the front office actually wants to make it or not.